Hi everyone, in this video we're going to be talking about task 7.5. So go ahead and flip to page 32 in your packet if you're not already there. We're going to be discussing what makes triangles congruent, and then also if we have two triangles congruent, what information we can get from that. Okay, so you should be on page 32, but I'm going to have us flip ahead to page 35. So top of page 35 looks at measuring sides of triangles, but we're going to skip that and go to the bottom here where it says congruent triangles. So if you did the investigation in class, you might have seen some of this, but if not, let's talk about what makes two triangles congruent. So two triangles are congruent if one of two things happens. So the first one is all three pairs of corresponding sides are congruent, and the second thing we would need then is all three pairs of corresponding angles are congruent. So we're going to talk about what it means to be corresponding sides and corresponding angles. This is really important when we're writing congruent statements. So we've seen congruent statements with segments and with angles before, but now let's look at how we write a congruent statement for triangles. For this, let's actually flip over to the next page since we didn't look at those other triangles yet. So on page 36, it wants us to write a congruent statement for the pairs of triangles shown. So first we're looking at triangle UTS, and then our second triangle is triangle DEC. So when I'm looking to write a congruent statement, first I want to see, do I have three pairs of corresponding angles and sides? Well, let's look, do I have three pairs of corresponding sides? Well, we have one tick mark over here at TS, one at DC, so those two sides are congruent. Then we have two tick marks on these two sides, and then three tick marks on that those last pairs, which tells us that we have three congruent sides, three pairs of congruent sides here. And then now we also want to look at the angles. So here I can see angle T has two tick marks. Angle D also has two tick marks. Angle U has three tick marks up here. Angle E has three tick marks at the bottom. And angle S has one, and so does angle C. So now we have three pairs of congruent three pairs of congruent sides and three pairs of congruent angles. Now we want to put this in our congruent statement, but we have to make sure that we write it correctly so that the angles and sides correspond to each other in that name. So we're going to start by just first naming the first triangle however we like to. So I'm going to start with this first triangle on the left, and I'm going to name it triangle TUS. So now when I name my second triangle, if I'm saying they're congruent, again, I have to be careful that the angles and sides are corresponding to each other. So what that means is I'm going to start with whatever vertex on my triangle has the same angle or the congruent angle to angle T, because then those are corresponding angles. So what angle corresponds to angle T in this second triangle? Well, that would be angle D up here, right? We have two tick marks at the top. So angle D corresponds to angle T. So I'm going to put D first just because T is first in that other triangle's name. All right, my corresponding angle to U, again, U had three tick marks, so I'm looking at E, which also has three tick marks. So angle U corresponds to angle E. That leaves me with two angles left, and we can just double check. Angle S has one tick mark, angle C has one tick mark, so those are corresponding angles in these triangles. So C is going to be our last point here, and we can see that
triangle TUS is congruent to triangle DEC. Again, it's really important that we check that all of these parts are corresponding to each other before we write this triangle's name, the second one. We couldn't just write it in any order because we have to make sure we have those corresponding sides and angles. I just looked at the angles to do this, but you could also look at the sides to put the name in order. So if I look at TU here, side TU has 2 tick marks, and side DE in the second triangle, that also has 2 tick marks. So that would be good. Those are corresponding sides. If we look at the next side that would be made here, segment US has 3 tick marks here, and then in our second triangle that's EC, so EC up here has 3 tick marks as well, so that would also be a pair of corresponding sides. And then your last one, TS, would be the first and the last on both, and then DC again, first and last. Those sides have 1 tick mark, so these would be corresponding sides for all of those. Again, you only have to really look at either the corresponding angles or the corresponding sides depending on how you want to name it in this scenario, but either one would work to give you that same order as long as you're very careful that all of those angles and sides correspond to each other properly. All right, let's take a look at this second example here. So this one's a little different. We have 2 triangles here. I have triangle RQP and triangle QPD, but they're connected in this one. So what I'm going to do again is I can see that they have corresponding angles and corresponding sides, and I want to name this so that we can clearly see what those corresponding sides and angles are. So let's start by just looking at the angles. I'm going to start with the top here. I'm going to start with Q, and then we'll go up to R at the top, and then P. Again, I'm going to look at the angles when I name this first. So what angle corresponds to angle RQP in this first triangle? What angle in the bottom triangle has 2 tick marks? Good. Hopefully you said angle QPD. And remember, here we have 2 angles at this vertex, so we have to be careful that we're naming it specifically. So we would have to say QPD for that angle. But that would be point P in this second triangle, so I'm going to start with P. R had 3 tick marks. Angle R had 3 tick marks. In my bottom triangle, that's here at the bottom at point D. So D is going to be our next part of our name, our next point in our name. And then our last angle, angle RPQ, had 1 tick mark, and that corresponds to angle PQD, which also has 1 tick mark in the bottom one. So Q will be our last point here. Again, you can go through checking if the sides correspond. This one is a little bit different again because these are connected through one of their sides. So what you might notice is that in our first example, we saw 2 sides with 1 tick mark each, right? In this triangle, I have 2 sides with 2 tick marks and 2 sides with 3 tick marks, but there's only 1 side here with 1 tick mark. That's a little bit different. So what that is, when we see this, it's actually something special. This is called the reflexive property. And what that means is if I have a shared side here, side QP is congruent to side PQ between these triangles. So if I have side QP, segment QP is congruent to segment PQ because they're the same side. So these 2 sides would be the corresponding, the same side would be the corresponding sides in those 2 triangles. So sometimes we'll mark that, or you might show that with like an X to remind you that this is reflexive property, just to remind you, again, since it's the same side, that segment's congruent to itself, so we have a corresponding side there. And in our name, we can see that QP and PQ, those are both first and last in both of those names, so these would be congruent triangles with that corresponding side of QP in both triangles.
All right, let's get some practice on the next section here. It tells us, suppose that triangle AMV is congruent to triangle SRB. So if we have those two triangles congruent, let's draw a picture to show that those triangles are congruent. And then I want to include markings to indicate those congruent parts. So make sure you're always including your markings here. I'm just going to draw any two triangles. Any two triangles. They might not look too congruent, but I want them to look relatively the same. Okay, and this is triangle AMV and triangle SRB. So let's mark this triangle up, these triangles, to show that they're congruent, or what their congruent and corresponding sides are. So we can start with angle A and angle S. Since those both come first here, I know that those are going to be my corresponding angles. So we can show that with one tick mark. Our next pair of corresponding angles is going to be angle M and angle R. We'll show that with two tick marks. Angle M is corresponding to angle R, so those are congruent. And lastly, angle V corresponds to angle B, so three tick marks here. Angle B is congruent to angle V. Now, I know that angles are congruent, but we also need to show that our sides are congruent. So if we look at that first segment here, side AM, it corresponds to side SR. So I'm going to show that with one tick mark there. Again, those are the first 2 points in our name, AR and SR. Or sorry, AM and SR. The next side would be MV and RB. So MV is congruent to RB. Show that with two tick marks. And then our last side, again, this would be our first and last points that they give us. So side AV is corresponding to side SB. So those are going to be congruent. Again, you could check the order in that they come up in the name up here just to make sure, but those are going to be our corresponding sides and angles for these two triangles. So we know that all of those are congruent, so make sure you include those markings to show that congruence. All right, in this last question, we want to list all of the parts of the congruent, all of the pairs of congruent parts of these triangles. So actually writing out what is congruent in these. So let's start with our angles, since that's what we talked about first. And I'm going to give you I'm going to give you guys a second. Pause the video and see if you can name out all of those pairs of congruent parts in those triangles. You should find 6 things. So go ahead, try to pause the video and name those things. All right, hopefully you gave that a try and can check your answer now. So again, we can start by naming our congruent angles. So we have angle A congruent to angle S, angle M congruent to angle R. Those were both our green 2 tick marks. And our last pair with 3 tick marks was angle V congruent to angle B. Again, don't forget your angles in front here. We always have to make sure we have those. And then the last thing we want to do is also list out the pairs of congruent sides. So if we start with 1 tick mark, the pair with 1 tick mark, we have segment MB congruent to segment SR. Then we have 2 tick marks would be side MV congruent to side RB. And our last pair of corresponding sides is AV and SB at the bottom. So remember, you want to show all of those are congruent and list those out clearly. All right, so that is it from our congruent triangles. Again, we can kind of see what we need to show that 2 triangles are congruent, and then if we know that those triangles are congruent, what do we get from that? What do we know about the pairs of the sides and the angles? That's what we looked at in this last one. So that is it for this video. If you have any questions, feel free to stop by your teacher's office hours or ask us some questions in class. Have a good one.